we need to really start doing more to reach out to the parents. I mean, I can throw a few pizzas out there and get teenagers to come to the youth center any night of the week, but most of my teenagers that I see, maybe 60 or 70 different teenagers that I see in a week, there might be 15 to 20 of those who have parents in church on Sundays. And there's about another 5 or 10 that maybe go to church somewhere else on Sundays. But so over half of our youth group comes to church on Wednesday nights, and that's usually the only time I get to see them. And most of them have parents that are completely unchurched, and so we're trying to do some things to reach out to them. But with all that to say, man, I know it's really important for church to reach out to parents and all that kind of stuff. And I won't be here tomorrow, but I was kind of hoping I'd be able to come hear Brother Bandy preach again. I really appreciate his word every time that he preaches, every time I've heard him preach anyway. And so anyway, I just appreciate your pastor, and I hope you guys too, and show that to him every once in a while. That's probably the hardest job. I get to see my pastor if they're preaching, and then I get to see what happens after church, and he'll have a few people greet him and thank him, and then somebody will meet him in the office almost every week and complain about something he said, one little something. You don't ever have that, do you?
No. Everybody's happy.
And I know how difficult, man, you're up there trying to preach the word as best you can, and sometimes we argue over stuff that's so important. But I just want to ask you guys this morning, what do you think is the most important thing for a man in this church, or a believer, for a person that wants to glorify God? What do you think is the most important thing?
Other than salvation, I think it's faithfulness.
Think it's what?
Faithfulness.
Faithfulness? Anybody else?
Being in the Word and praying.
Winning the lost.
Mm-hmm. I was with a group of youth pastors. It's been several years ago, and I began to ask them that same question. And, of course, a lot of people said a lot of good things, being in church, and being saved, and reaching the lost, and being in the Word, and prayer, and a bunch of things, really, really good things. I mean, if you don't have salvation, what do you have? And so obviously those are, and I guess in different aspects, depending on what we're talking about, different things could be the most important at that time or whatever. And so I kind of understand that. And I thought about, as I was speaking to a group of youth pastors, I thought about Mark chapter 7, where you have the Pharisees, guys that they prayed on a regular basis. They were in the Word constantly and knew it better than probably any of us. And yet Jesus, sitting there in Mark chapter 7, basically calls them out. They were trying to call Jesus out. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus calls them out because they were very, very faithful to church and very, very faithful to, they thought, to God, to godliness, and very faithful to tithe and to give offerings to the church. And then in Mark chapter 7, Jesus says, well, you gave your offering to the church, but then your mother came and needed some help, and you told her what you would have helped her with, you've already given to the church, sorry. Mm-hmm. And so in another place, Jesus told them, that they shouldn't forsake the former things, the faithfulness and the praying, and they shouldn't forsake those things, but they should also be faithful to take care of their family and to take care of their community and those who are in need. And so they were more about making themselves look good than really helping somebody else out and that type of deal. And similarly, I think a lot of times, maybe as men, is maybe we go to church faithfully, and yet we forget some other things that are even, I think, more important in God's Word. And we're going to look at that real quick. I've been teaching adults in my church from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and just kind of tell you where that comes from. Over in Matthew 24, they come to Jesus and they say, what's the most important commandment? And normally, if somebody asked us that, we would probably think of the Ten Commandments. But it's been said that the Pharisees, they had not only the Ten Commandments, but the whole book of the law. And then not only the book of the law, they had all these other laws that they kind of added to that. And so it was said that maybe they might have had as many as 600 different commands that they had in mind when they came to Jesus and said, what's the most important command? And Jesus kind of boils it down and makes it real simple. And he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. and or actually, yeah, heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. But that's kind of, he said that's the most important command.
Mm-hmm.
And there in Matthew 24, what he was quoting from was Deuteronomy chapter 6. And I'm just going to read a couple of verses to you. And it said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And these commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up." And just a little pointer here real quick. It says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Jesus said all your heart, soul, and mind. I'm not smart enough to understand all of that, but I think you go from the Hebrew to the Greek. In the Hebrew, when you say heart, they understood that included the entire inner man. It includes your mind and your heart, your emotions, anything that's basically comes from the inside when they talk about the heart. Whereas, in the New Testament, when Jesus said that, probably in Aramaic, when they thought of the heart, it might have been more like what we think of the heart, and that's normally our emotions. And so he had to include the word mind so that they knew it was something that goes on in our mind. To know God is to love Him. If we're not growing in our knowledge of God, we're probably not going to grow in our love of Him.
Right.
And so the two and two, the heart and the mind, I don't think God separates those two things the way we do in our day and time. And I think that's probably a very good thing that they go together. It's been said, if you say you love someone but there's not an emotion to go with that, that's probably a bad idea. However, if you have all the emotions but you're not acting on the will of your mind, then that's probably not a good thing either. Emotions make a good sidekick, but not a good leader.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you've had teenagers around, you know that emotions are a very bad leader.
Amen.
So, but what I just want to share with you for just a couple minutes is this. If to love the Lord our God is the most important thing, that's the most important command, to love Him. There's some things that overflow from that. I mean, it might be prayer, it's faithfulness, it's being involved with God's people. 1 John chapter 1 says, man, if you say you love God but you don't love God's people, then you're a liar. And so we know that there's some things that accompany that love that we have for God. But one of the things that I think has maybe been missing in modern churches is that we say we love God, and then we bring our kids to church so that somebody else can teach our kids about God. And I think the thing that's maybe missing in most of our homes and even in our churches, and the reason that we're beginning to see where the younger generation is losing their faithfulness. Once they get out of high school, go to college, it's always been that, people would kind of maybe go to college and not be involved in church as much, and then they would get married later on, and then they would get back involved in church and that type of deal. But what we're seeing is people are getting out of college and getting married, or maybe not ever getting married, and never returning to the church, even those who have been brought up in Christian homes. Mm-hmm. And that's obviously, there's some exceptions, but we're seeing that a whole lot. And I think it's maybe based on this right here, is that we, just like everything else in life, we begin to farm out the responsibility of discipling our children to somebody else. And it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. So basically, everything that we are, we're to be consumed with this love for God in every area, every aspect of our life, no matter what we're doing. I shared with a group of youth pastors one time, I was telling you earlier, asked them what's the most important thing, and the title of that was God is not a priority. And I told those guys, if you make God a priority, then you kind of compartmentalize Him and say, God's a priority on Sunday, and I'll be real faithful to that. But then we kind of forget in our other priorities. And I told them that God is to be the purpose of every priority.
Amen.
We don't compartmentalize and just say, okay, He's a priority, so I'm going to get up early and read my Bible, then I'm going to go to work. No, the reason you go to work, you ought to have a purpose there, and it is to evangelize those people you work with. When you go home, the purpose of your home ought to be to raise those children so that they grow up loving God, and that overflows out. And so, when are we supposed to teach our children? It says in verse 7, it says, these commandments are to be on your heart. And then in verse 7 it says, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. And so it gives us 4 specific things there, but let me ask you, when is there a time of day that you're not either at home or going somewhere, or that you're waking up or going to sleep. I mean, basically he's saying every aspect of your life, you're supposed to be passing this love that you have for God. You're supposed to be passing that on to your children. And I think that, you know, maybe your homes are different. I hope so. But in most homes, you know, we say we're Christian, and we might even be faithful to come to church, but rarely ever do we sit around the table or sit around maybe a bed or whatever and open up the Scripture and begin to teach it to our children. And not only that, it says, you know, as you walk along the road, you know, as we walk along the road, as these people were nomadic at this time in Deuteronomy 6, but for us, I think that just means when we're taking our kids to school, when we're going on vacation, whatever it is, man, that every aspect of our life is an opportunity for us to teach our children. And one of the things I want to throw out here is, even in the Sunday school class I'm teaching right now, you know, I have one couple who they had one child and he's grown and gone. You know, one of the beautiful things about following God is if your kids are already grown and maybe gone, you know, you can't go back and change that. But one of the cool things that I believe about following God is that God doesn't beat us up for what happened 20 years ago, but that God picks us up where we are today.
Amen.
And He begins to transform us and change us from the inside out. My pastor was in college. He was an all-conference pitcher for OU. And one weekend, or one evening during the week, his dad was a deacon in the church and was faithful in the church. But one day, my pastor, Brother Scott, he got a phone call from his dad. And he said, "Son, I know that I've always been faithful to go to church and stuff." He said, "But we went to revival tonight, and I figured out that I've just been kind of walking through the motions." He said, "But you know what? I got saved tonight at revival." And the next day, my pastor drove home to go see his dad and go to church, and had been raised in the church his entire life. And at that time, he went home and went to revival the rest of that week, and he was saved at that same revival after hearing the testimony of his dad. He basically realized that he and his dad were both in the same boat. If you asked him if they were Christians, they would say, "Yeah, but they were living for the Lord." And took several years later, on down the road, my pastor was a coach for a while, and he began to realize that his need to shape the spiritual growth of his child and want to get them under a preacher that would really teach the Word. And he said, "I just got convicted that God was calling me to be that pastor, to be that preacher." And so no matter what age or stage you are in life, you know, you're getting serious about loving God. You can, no matter how old your kids are, real little, real big, whatever, that God can use you to teach them and shape their lives and stuff. And I just want to throw that out there and say that I think that is one of the most important things.
Man.
How important are your relationship to your children? Here's an idea for you. The very last verse of the Old Testament, God told the nation of Israel that if they would turn their hearts toward their children and their children to their fathers, that He would heal their land. That's the last thing God said to the nation of Israel, followed by 400 years of silence. One of the first things when Jesus spoke to the angel that came to Zechariah, John's father, John the Baptist was dead. He begins to explain to John's dad who John was, and he was going to basically lead the way for the Messiah and prepare people's hearts for that. And he said that he would turn the hearts of children to their fathers and their fathers to their children. And if that were to happen, then He would heal their land. You know, I think that's pretty important to God. If it's the first and last thing He said in the Old Testament, the first thing in the New Testament, I think God is calling us to turn our hearts to our children. In Deuteronomy 6, right after that, He says, "Love the Lord your God and teach it to your children." He says, "And when you go into the land and you have barns that you did not build, and vineyards, you eat from vineyards that you did not grow," and basically it talks about all the abundance that they'll have in the land. He said, "Don't forget the Lord your God."
Yeah.
I think as men, we love our families, and we go to work, and we want to provide for them, and all that kind of stuff, and that's what we're called to be, providers for our home. Sometimes I think in the effort to provide an overabundance for our families, I think we forget about the most important thing, which is to teach them to love God, and we allow our careers and maybe our own personal pursuits and selfishness and things to get in the way of the true love for God and the true love for our families. And so, just leave you with that encouragement and that warning. Don't get wrapped up in stuff other than loving God and loving your family. If anything takes away from that, I think we need to take a step back and say, how can we reshape our lives in such a way that God is returned as the purpose of all the things we do. So, that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Amen. Thanks, Glen. Appreciate that.
Good.